In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was in a full state of environmental doomerism, just reading article after article about the world ending. I had to really fight this feeling of deeply rooted sadness and anger that comes alongside realizing that the planet you care for so deeply is being pretty rapidly destroyed by systems that aren't always in your control. I also spent a lot of time watching the feel-good travel and environmental documentary series Down to Earth with Zac Efron.
That's Mother Earth, bro. Yeah! That's a contribution to the planet. I love that.
Season 1 of Down to Earth with Zac Efron is like my Roman Empire. I think about it constantly. I talk about it to a fault. For those of you who aren't lucky enough to have watched the show, in 2018, a teen heartthrob turned handsome Squidward Zac Efron teamed up with superfoods guru Darren Olean to travel the world, solve the environmental crisis,
The so-called green movement.
and eat some Michelin star food while doing so.
If I had to compare it to something, steak in Japan.
Wagyu.
Yeah, yeah, something like that.
The release of Down to Earth had a lot of viewers really confused. Why is Zac Efron making a show about environmental preservation? And they would be right to be skeptical. A quick Google search of his former activist activities show up pretty sparse. The only thing I could find was a partnership between him and General Mills / Nature Valley of granola bar fame, who teamed up to teach people about plastic recycling, a campaign that was quickly debunked by an investigation by Bloomberg Green. So, good stuff, everyone. Now, this phenomenon is nothing new. Celebrities and social figures have been the face of environmental activism for decades now. Think Jane Fonda's undying commitment to the environmental movement, or Brigitte Bardot's controversial place in seal hunting campaigns. Celebrities have also lent their voices and cash to produce and voice environmental documentaries, like Leonardo DiCaprio or David Attenborough. And celebrity involvement in activist movements can be a really great thing, giving such a huge platform to movements that may not be widely discussed. Celebrities are also, unfortunately, notorious for sometimes being just wildly out of touch.
Nothing to kill or die for.
So with all these environmental documentaries and celebrity figures, why is Down to Earth with Zac Efron the leech on my brain? The show makes me uncomfortable in a way that was kind of hard to pinpoint on my first viewing. Now, there are some obvious reasons. The ridiculously half-baked non-solutions the show presented.
Let's get that out there, man.
Can't wait to tell the whole world about this.
Thank you, guys.
The unbearable lack of chemistry between Zac and Darren.
Where's the aircrafts? Where are the UFOs?
Where's the elves?
Exactly.
Side note, this video is not a personal attack on Zac Efron. Actually kind of love the guy, find him really endearing. Also, kind of personally offended that he wasn't nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars for his wonderful performance in The Iron Claw. If anything, this video is a personal attack on Darren Olean. But regardless, there's something darker that lingers right under the surface of the show. The boys visit European countries with innovative solutions to the energy and resource crises, and visit Central and South America to find resources to exploit. So the show has been probed for its simplistic non-solutions to the environmental crisis and its just general hilarity.
Dude, what a cool chick.
That was amazing.
She was awesome.
But what I'm most interested in is discussing the ways in which the show, in some ways, perfectly depicts environmental Western thinking in regards to slow violence and environmental globalization. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what's globalization? And what does it have to do with environmental violence and the show in large? In this video, I'd like to focus on 2 episodes of Down to Earth, specifically the one in Puerto Rico and the one in Costa Rica. And I want to use these sites as kind of jumping off points to break down the really difficult histories of the Caribbean, intertwining site-specific struggles with issues of globalization and the environmental discourse that stems from it. But before we dig into the political comedy horror that is Down to Earth, let's just do a quick geopolitical crash course. And if you're all up to date with your terminology, I put some timestamps in the video so you can skip ahead as you please. Part 1, globalization. Globalization can be broadly defined as the way international trading of goods and services, knowledge, and culture has affected the world socially and economically. This can include trade agreements, multinational corporations, communication technologies, migration, and international supply chains. The beginning of globalization roughly dates back to somewhere between the 18th and 19th century Europe, in which nations would discover land and claim it in order to settle colonies and better facilitate natural resource extraction and trading. While the goal of globalization is to connect nations and create a sense of global economic liberty, this generally benefits the global north, right here, also known as the First World, through cheaper outsourced labor, access to resources, and cultural enrichment. On the other side of things, the global south, over here, also known as the Third World, experiences unfair labor wages and conditions, unequal trade relationships, and the effects of displaced environmental violence. So now you may be thinking, hey, this sounds really familiar. Kind of sounds like colonialism. And you wouldn't be wrong. Abel Hadi Bashir explains that, quote, by definition, globalization is the expansion of communication links between different regions, whereas colonialism was the expansion of both power and territory. However, the two are similar in the sense that the powerful have an upper hand and can increase their profits at the expense of the poor. Part 3. Neocolonialism. While the continents of Latin America and Africa are considered to be post-colonial, Kwame Anthony Appiah asked the question, what does post-colonial mean when the history of colonialism still lingers economically, geographically, and socio-politically? Andrew Vatz defines neocolonialism as, quote, using economic and cultural forces to exert control over an independent country that used to be a colony. I'm going to be less specific with my discussion of neocolonialism because I think that the show actually offers really rich examples of this, so we're going to slowly kind of unveil this throughout the video. The show's very overt discourse surrounding their time in Europe and Latin America is inherently based in these economic, political, and cultural ideologies. And throughout my analysis of these videos, I'm going to slowly break down how. After taking some time to solve global water and energy crises in Iceland and France, Zac and Darren jet out to Costa Rica to visit Darren's good friend and expert in being a trust fund kid who started a white expat commune in post-colonial land that is now being rapidly overtaken by white settlers again. So it is of note that all of the guys in the episode are just annoying as hell. Maybe even more annoying than Darren, which is honestly a feat. I'm specifically talking about this ringleader here, the white guy who looks like he learned empathy from mushrooms. This episode is bad, but this guy just makes it so insufferable. It's honestly kind of wild. Zac and Darren really focus on the expat culture of Puerto Rico in this episode, as opposed to its locals, which we're going to talk about in a bit. And it was definitely a choice. While visiting the commune, Zac and Darren are exposed to a number of delicious local fruits, and the duo poignantly ask the question, why don't people in America eat like this more often? The dissonance between the idea of the local and Zac and Darren's instinctual reaction to relate back to America is a common thread we'll see throughout most of the episodes we'll be touching on. So this episode is all about self-reliance, from the commune's growth of food to their expat school system. This, objectively, all well and good on the surface, I guess. A community made with the objective of self-sustainability and a rich sense of responsibility towards the earth and the human body. But then again, why are we focusing on rich white people who moved to Costa Rica and can definitely afford this lifestyle? See, the Caribbean is intertwined with a deeply rooted history of colonialism and neoliberalism. In the introduction to Storm Signals, Structural Adjustment, and Development Alternatives in the Caribbean, Kathy McAfee writes that, quote, in the 500 years since the entrepreneur-explorer Christopher Columbus stepped ashore in the Caribbean, human society and its environment have changed more rapidly than in the preceding 5 millennia of civilization. The age we think of as beginning with Columbus's voyage has seen unprecedented plunder and destruction, and also undreamed of achievement. As a result, for better or for worse, the world has become one, unquote. Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean led to the swift acquisition, or better, colonization, of what we now know as the Americas. The islands of the Caribbean were acquired primarily by the Spanish, English, Dutch, and French, as we can see on this map. Haiti became the first Caribbean country to gain independence in the year 1804. Throughout the next 2 centuries, the area would slowly begin to decolonize. While countries in the former Spanish Empire, such as Mexico and Costa Rica, gained independence in the first half of the 19th century, Other countries, such as Jamaica and Belize, would not see independence until the second half of the 20th century. While technically a post-colonial country, the entire discourse surrounding Costa Rica in this episode revolves around expats, people who move from different countries, often America, who are often white, and often think that they know best what to do with the land. While the topic of environmental activism is very clearly being addressed, it's really done without the idea of local in mind, at all. Other channels like We're in Hell have talked about this. We're in Hell specifically brought up the fact that this entire episode, Darren and Zac don't talk to a single local person. In fact, the only local people being depicted are the ones helping out the expats.
It's unfair to the people, it's unfair to the earth, it's unfair to the wildlife.
I know some of you are probably thinking, Emma, what if they don't speak Spanish? What if it's just a language barrier? But the boys did have translators in other parts of their trip, so argue that. The way the show frames Costa Rica as a barren jungle land is also so wild.
It is primitive here.
It's really giving terra nullius, a term which translates to a country without a master or a no man's land, and is often used by settler colonizers to justify their takeover of indigenous land. And then you have Zac Efron saying, I'm not saying I'm gonna move to the middle of the jungle in Costa Rica, but I might. Good boy. Good stuff. Episode 5 takes place in Puerto Rico in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Marina. Unlike Costa Rica, Zac does not attempt to exoticize the land or apply that terra nullius bullshit. He recognizes that America already stuck its grubby little flag in Puerto Rican soil, so not a problem there. Up until this point, I was actually having a lot of fun with the show because it's silly. It's inherently silly and funny.
Oh, this is a nut cruncher, huh?
This episode just confused the hell out of me. In a lot of ways, it's actually the show at its strongest, highlighting innovative solutions for sustainability and disaster prevention. But Zac and Darren just don't shut up, so that's good. Darren and Zac fly into San Juan and immediately notice the damage of the hurricanes. It was literally unavoidable for them to talk about this. It was so obvious. While Darren is off, hunting for superfoods, Zac meets up with the former mayor of San Juan, Carmen Yolanda Cruz, to discuss the disaster and its treacherous aftermath. In this conversation, Zac is really genuinely engaged and eager to understand this crisis. I'm not being facetious when I say that a portion of this episode is actually really informative and relevant to the discourse surrounding global environmental destruction. Then, of course, Zac says,
Puerto Rico, to me, represents a microcosm of the whole world on a certain scale. I mean, what's going to happen when this hits New York City?
Because why wouldn't he? He just has to do it, right? While this line is pretty seldom discussed, I see it, in a way, as a really nice encapsulation of the show's entire subtextual message. When the news of the New York floods of October 2022 hit the news, I thought about this episode. Are the effects of global warming serious enough now? Obviously, I know that's not what Zac Efron was thinking. He clearly sees Puerto Rico hurricanes as a product of global warming that must be remedied. But I also couldn't help thinking, does he, at some level, see these global southern disasters as more of a warning sign for things to come in the global north? Why would we imagine what would happen if this hits New York if you're already seeing it hit San Juan? Which I will also add, Zac, American. Does this speak more to Zac's familiarity with mainland America, or to the greater idea that the destruction of urban hubs in America are inherently more destructive than those in the global south? Based on Zac and Darren's tendencies to relate all matters back to mainland American issues, I'd say it's a bit of both. This also showcases the problem with the concept of globalization itself. While the idea behind globalization would be to create a more connected world, in many ways, this just means a world that is more dependent on the global north. This dependence, beyond the devastating effects of colonialism, is partially due to the actual clusterfuck that is the creation of the World Bank.
Hey, editing Emma here. So basically my explanation of the World Bank is kind of bad, but all to say, in the 1960s and 1970s, the World Bank was giving an insane amount of money to the global south, including a lot of the Caribbean.
And by the 1980s, it became clear that a lot of these countries just wouldn't be able to pay them back. So a new idea, rooted in the popular neoliberal theory, was formed, which takes us to structural adjustment. I am not an economist, if you couldn't tell. I have a BFA and a master's in film studies, but from what I understand, this essentially means that these countries are given even more money to focus on building export-friendly systems through which they will eventually supposedly pay off their debts. In Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Rob Nixon explains that the creation of free market using IMF structural adjustment heavily hindered the operation of small family-run Jamaican farmers, who could not compete with the prices of federally subsidized American products like onions, potatoes, and milks. Because of this, the country was forced to focus on tourism as a major source of income, which just in turn has created a whole other clusterfuck of issues, both culturally and environmentally. So while Costa Rica is currently just like a crazy amount in debt and undergoing IMF structural adjustment, Puerto Rico couldn't even take out a loan if they wanted to, given their status as a U.S. territory. But they're currently facing a pretty similar situation. So basically, Latin America and a large portion of the global south have been affected by debt and structural adjustment. Now, I'd just like to quickly circle back to the concept of tourism that we were just talking about in reference to Jamaica. So through situating the Caribbean as a tourist destination, as the show is a travel documentary, the communities of this area are often othered regardless of mostly Efron's efforts. I don't think Darren gives a shit at all. The resources of these areas are seen as commodities for Americans, again highlighting America's neocolonial situation. So aside from Efron's occasionally charming lack of tact and Darren's colonial brand of lifestyle thinking, the show's structure just really suffers from ADHD Michael Moore editing, I guess. I don't know how else to say it. They're just going from one issue to another. They're solar power, sustainable farming, ocean conservation, all in the span of 10 minutes, I swear. I will give the show credit in one way. Out of all the episodes I've seen, especially in the global south, this is the one that touches on the local the most and in the most effective way. There's actually a really interesting scene where Zac attends a community meeting to talk about sustainable development, and it's honestly really interesting, and I feel like if the show could have just focused on that, it could have actually been kind of cool. Okay, so now I know I said that I was going to focus only on the Caribbean episodes, but we just need a second to talk about the finale in Peru because my God, that is actual cinema. There's just so much unreal tension between Zac and Darren. It's wild. So I haven't really touched on Zac and Darren all that much, but I think I've made it pretty clear that Zac, innocent golden retriever guy, Darren, evil superfoods guy. And they're just it's really evident, these two polar opposites in this episode. So in this episode, we get some wild insight about their personal lives through a pretty bleak montage of calls from Darren's family and ex-wife when the news of his Malibu home burning down breaks. Darren decides for some reason to stay on the episode. I think Zac wants to break the tension, which is kind of funny, but it didn't work. And it's kind of awkward.
Well, best way to travel. Tuk-tuk. Tuk-tuk.
So that was weird. But the weirdest thing happens at the end of the episode when Darren goes back to Malibu and sees the rubble that was once his home. He gets out of the car and he's just I don't even want to do it. I'm just going to play it. And then the credits roll, and he's still screaming, and then it's just over. That's the end of season 1. So this ending is really, really bleak, right? And I think beyond being bleak, it's almost selfish. Of course, if I was filming a travel series with some guy I didn't even like and heard that my house burned down, would I be a huge distracted downer? Yeah, of course. But would I greenlight having the entire season end on the sound of my voice screaming over the rubble of my former home? I don't think so either. And this also brings me back to the big point that I was talking about Zac and the hurricane before. I feel like the way this ending is framed really highlights Zac and Darren's self-interest and the idea that America, specifically North America, is in many ways the center of the world. What the scene is essentially telling us is that when environmental destruction hits the wealthy pockets of the US, they become urgent, while environmental destruction of the global South, like in Puerto Rico, is just an unfortunate reality. While this is certainly not the kind of forward environmentalist thinking that we should be engaging with as like a primary ideology, I felt like it was oddly poignant to kind of just look into the ways in which white rich people understand both the world and environmentalism. Darren in general just kind of refuses to see the dark parts of environmentalism, focusing instead on the holistic healing side of things, which is an inherently privileged view. The people he chooses to meet are rich expats who come from similar Western holistic views as him that share, at least to some extent, the same idea of the local as him, from health perspectives as opposed to cultural or geological ones. I actually have a lot to say about Darren, and I was going to talk about the 2 episodes he did in Peru talking about health foods, but it just like really didn't fit in this episode. So if that's something you're interested in doing, I've actually done like so much research on Darren and on just like the export of superfoods. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, drop a comment down below and I'm going to make that. Useful climate activism exists delicately between denialism and doomerism, 2 wholly unproductive, but honestly kind of natural reactions to climate change. I spent a good portion of my life tiptoeing between the 2 sides, never really ready to challenge myself to look at the problem head on because, frankly, I was scared. Coming back to my introduction, the pandemic was a really important time for me to realize that me sitting around being sad is really not going to do anything, so that's good.
Right. So much to think about.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
a lot. It's just like...
The reality of the situation is the global South isn't in a position to dwell in environmental doom because they're enduring environmental violence displaced from the global North. The effects of displaced environmental violence may not be readily noticeable because it is an inherently slow and creeping process. In Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Rob Nixon describes this slow yet devastating violence occurring in the global South due to toxic drift, testing, dumping, among other things, stating that when these kinds of actions are imposed in these communities, they always leave behind delayed and lasting effects. In the opening of Slow Violence, Nixon discusses former World Bank leader Lawrence Summers' advocacy of exporting and dumping toxic waste in Africa, under the guise that it would, quote, help correct an inefficient global imbalance in toxicity, unquote. Here, Nixon discusses this notorious proposal as a key example of global northern thinking. While Lawrence Summers' connection between unsightly waste and Africa as an out-of-sight continent aren't inherent values placed in the show, I feel like they're still really relevant. While the global North is allowed to dwell in an uncomfortable sense of environmental malaise, offset by the very literal displacement of environmental violence,
the global North has the luxury of producing content like Down to Earth with Zac Efron.
If you've gotten this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. This is a video topic that, like I said before, I've been wanting to talk about for a while. I just finished my master's in film studies talking about environmental education, and environmental education is a topic that I'm just so passionate about. I'm so happy to have shared my first video essay with you. Again, I am so interested in doing another video about Darren and health foods. I have some other topics that I'm really interested in, but if you have any suggestions, I really kind of want this channel to focus primarily on popular media and environmental education. So if you have any topics that you want to go a little deeper in there, let me know. And please like this video, share this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. I would love to just continue making content. I find so much joy in it. So yeah, thank you.